and historical ecology of islands in general. But I'm going to do it in a case study from California's Northern Channel Islands, where I've worked for more than 40 years, participating with lots of colleagues, archaeologists as well, and also many Native American people from the Chumash tribe. The Channel Islands are Chumash land, and I want to acknowledge that before I start. I'm very fortunate to have been born and raised in Chumash territory and to have the honor of working on to help understand the deep history of the Chumash in the Santa Barbara Channel and on the Northern Channel Islands. So here's the title, and what's pictured here is a dense shell midden on San Miguel Island. This is what we call a red abalone midden. For the large red abalone shells that are visible there, even though the bulk of the matrix is made up of California mussels. These are very distinctive sites, as you'll see. I'll talk about them more later. So just to give you some idea of who I am, what my biases are, I always try to start with this. I was born and raised surfing, swimming, diving, sailing, and generally fooling around in the waters of the Pacific in Santa Barbara area and also on the islands of Hawaii. So this has profoundly shaped my preconceptions and my views on the world, and especially my views on the archaeology and historical ecology of islands and coastal ecosystems around the world. So when I got to graduate school in the 1980s at UC Santa Barbara, and I started reading texts such as these, I didn't always believe them. These were very prominent anthropologists like Sherwood Washburn, who said, for early man, water was a barrier and a danger, not a resource. And another one, a good friend of mine over the years, David Yesner, who wrote, I think, an unfortunate sentence that it's a historical fact that maritime resources were not exploited until relatively late in prehistory, actually until the last 10,000 or 15,000 years. And then I was also raised as a North American archaeologist in the middle of a paradigm from the 20th century that saw the peopling of the Americas as a wholly terrestrial endeavor, with terrestrial hunter-gatherer peoples marching out of Northeast Asia and Beringia through the fabled ice-free corridor and down into the plains of North America, and then only gradually spreading to the sea, where they slowly learned that fish were edible and shellfish were too, and how to become maritime peoples. This paradigm, of course, left the Pacific coast and California, made it basically completely irrelevant to any story about the peopling of the New World. And I was fortunate enough to just start in graduate school about the time that Knut Fladmark at University of British Columbia put forth the coastal migration theory. And even though there wasn't a lot of evidence for it at the time, and I was warned by one of my advisors that I shouldn't talk about it or write about it because it could ruin my career, I did talk and write about it. And I spent much of the first 20 years of my career, in fact, tilting at these windmills about how coastlines weren't very productive, and people didn't turn to them until late in time, and that the peopling of the New World was by terrestrial people. And by around 2000, I had written a couple of major syntheses about the greater antiquity of maritime adaptations, of fishing, of aquatic adaptations, and also about the possibility, the hypothesis that people moved into the New World, maybe through an ice-free corridor, but also coming down the coast of the North Pacific Rim. And then I put one more quote in here from one of my mentors and good friend, Melvin Akins, 1990. The idea that early people adapted to a maritime lifeway might have first entered the Americas via the Northwest coast. It's not just unlikely, but imponderable. This was the state of things in 1990. And yet we all know, I think today, that the ecology, history, and archaeology of coastlines and nearshore marine systems can be remarkably productive. These areas provide resources from both terrestrial and marine habitats, and it seemed imponderable to me that humans would ignore coastlines through most of human history. And because I had a strong interest in geoarchaeology and the application of geological principles to interpreting the archaeological record, it also was obvious to me in reading papers by mostly geologists who warned archaeologists that the deep history of human fishing and coastal dispersals may have been obscured by post-glacial sea level rise and the whole fluctuating, oscillating glacial interglacials of the Pleistocene, in which sea levels rose and fell multiple times. And of course, we live at a time of relatively high sea level, as shown in the lower left, and with sea levels 120 meters below present, 25,000 years ago. The apparent explosion of shell middens around the world during the last 7, 8, 10,000 years might very well just be an artifact of sea level history and the inundation of lower sea levels, lower coastlines, and lower coastal lowlands. And of course, after the last 20 years or so, we now know that coastlines, including lake shores in Africa, were occupied by Homo habilis, by Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and in fact, aquatic resources were being collected by these earlier hominins. But it also seems true to me that with the advent of Homo sapiens and their spread around the world, aquatic resource use intensified. And as the caption says here, this is Pinnacle Point, where Curtis Marion has documented coastal shell middens as much as 164,000 years old. And there have been similar middens associated with Neanderthals in the Mediterranean and also the Atlantic facade. And then we also know through genetic data combined with archaeological data, or at least we suspect today, that coastlines played important roles in the dispersal of anatomically modern humans around the world. There's a southern dispersal route out of East Africa following the south coast of Asia that many have talked about, including myself and Todd Brady. We know that anatomically modern humans had reached island Southeast Asia by 50,000 or so years ago, that they'd colonized Australia through a series of maritime crossings by at least 50,000 years ago, into near Oceania 35, 40,000 years ago, and also in the Ryukyu Islands and Okinawa, and then islands offshore of Japan, where there are obsidian sources that required boats to reach, at relatively early dates. By 35,000 years ago, we know there were people in the Japanese archipelago in relatively cool waters who had boats and were going out to sea in them. And this raises the possibility that I've written a lot about, that they may have just continued moving around the North Pacific and ultimately followed the coastlines of the North Pacific Rim into North America and South America. So this was basically what I'm largely known for, the peopling of the Americas, maritime dispersals. But I also, around 2000, had a sort of a career transforming event. Here's the coastal migration theory and what's now become a ecological corollary of it, the Kelp Highway hypothesis. How did the Kelp Highway hypothesis grow out of the coastal migration theory? Well, to answer that, I have to go back to 2000, when Jeremy Jackson and some of his colleagues, the four people in the upper row here I've pictured, Jim Estes, Bob Stenick, Mike Graham, they invited me to come down to Santa Barbara to participate in a large synthesis at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And it was Jeremy's project about the deep history of fishing and overfishing and the serial collapse of marine ecosystems and fisheries around the world. He wanted to have the deep historical perspective, and he had 4 working groups, one of which was a kelp forest group, and that's what I joined eventually. But they had to kind of harass me to get me to come down. I was very busy. I was working concurrently in Alaska, the Oregon coast, the Channel Islands, and preparing to do some work on the Viking Age in Iceland. And although Santa Barbara as a town and a tourist attraction has a deep allure for a lot of people around the world, it had no allure for me. I was born there, I left there, moved to the Northwest, and I still work down there on a regular basis. So I kept telling them, well, you know, there are people right there at UCSB who can help you. Doug Kennett was a graduate student at that point working on the Channel Islands. Mike Glassow was my mentor with deep knowledge of the Channel Islands. But for some reason that I don't really understand, they persevered and harassed me until I flew down to Santa Barbara to meet with them. And as I said, it was a career transforming event or series of events and a series of meetings. It fundamentally changed the arc of my career. And after participating in that series of meetings, I also got deeply involved with other ecologists and biologists like Bob DeLong, Heike Lotze, Daniel Pauly, Paul Dayton, and have collaborated and written papers with them. This is a lot of older white men, as you can see, although Mike Graham is Hispanic. Heike Lotze, obviously not an older white man. But I do want to point out that the person who did invite me to join this group was Mia Tegner, famous marine ecologist from Scripps, who unfortunately died in a diving accident before I could meet her. Well, when I first went to the initial kelp forest group meeting in Santa Barbara, I showed this slide. This is a slide by Renee Volonowith of what we call red abalone middens, I mentioned at the very beginning. They date on the Channel Islands mostly between about 8,000 to 3,500 years ago, although we now have examples close to 11,500 years old and also a historic example. But the heyday of red abalone middens is in this time period. And I was just giving a general spiel about the Channel Islands and kelp forest resources that were utilized by the Chumash people. And I showed this slide and I just kind of breezed right by it. And every one of the biologists said, "Ho, stop, go back, go back. What is that?" I said, it's a red abalone midden. They're all over the northern Channel Islands and San Nic and in some areas along the mainland coast. And every one of them said and told me that a midden like that could not possibly exist if sea otters were present in the general area where these were collected. They don't have to be completely absent, but they have to be either nearly absent or extirpated for this kind of a fishery to have existed in the past. And the historic examples with the spread of sea otters as their populations have been growing bears this out. Everywhere that otters move into, these sort of red abalone fisheries, black abalone fisheries, pretty much disappear as a commercial enterprise. So archaeologists, including myself, have been talking about red abalone middens for, I don't know, 50 years, but not one of them had ever made this basic insight that sea otters could not have been present in this system at this time. There couldn't have been abundant. And it took ecologists who had a really deep understanding of the connections between various organisms to tell me that. I certainly am aware of ecology, biology, geology. I'm very interested in reconstructing ancient environments, paleogeography, but this kind of connection, which seems so simple to me today, it simply wasn't made by me or other archaeologists. Well, some of the products that came out of those meetings at NCEAS, one was a sort of manifesto in science, Jeremy Jackson et al., that 2001, that's widely cited, that talks about the deep history of human fishing and then the accelerating impact on historical fisheries and collapse of marine ecosystems. The second was a book that Andre mentioned, that Torben Rick, my former PhD student now at the Smithsonian, and I edited with case studies from around the world showing that in fact indigenous peoples often had measurable impacts on marine ecosystems long before Europeans arrived. And then the other thing that came out of it was the Kelp Highway hypothesis. It was not me that came up with this name. It was Bob Stenick. We were talking about the distribution of kelp forests around the Pacific Rim. I had worked on them near them in California, Oregon, Southeast Alaska, Southwest Alaska. I certainly knew a little bit about kelp forests and the resources they had, but it was Bob Stenick that said, "Oh my God, it was like a kelp highway." And my initial reaction was, kelp highway? It sounds like everybody's going 65 miles an hour, and it didn't happen that way. But eventually, we all kind of got on board and decided, yeah, this is not a bad descriptor for how the peopling of the Americas might have happened along the Pacific Rim. And it took a while. Bob Stenick and we all mentioned this briefly in a 2002 paper, but eventually in 2008 and 2015, we fully developed this kelp highway hypothesis. The one thing that really surprised me about it, having written about the coastal migration theory for, at that point, 20 plus years, was just how much media attention this got. And I think for me, it just proves the power of good marketing. A snazzy title like the Kelp Highway hypothesis got a lot more airplay than sort of a boring thing like the coastal migration theory. Well, now let me take you to the Channel Islands, and there are 8 Channel Islands. Southern ones you can see here: Santa Barbara, San Nick, Santa Catalina, and San Clemente are sort of widely dispersed off the Los Angeles and San Diego coast. But the northern islands are much more tightly constrained off the coast of Santa Barbara. And they were occupied by the island Chumash people for millennia, many millennia. And this is a picture of island Chumash house pits. They had very high population densities. Densities were probably even a little bit higher on the mainland coast adjacent to some large estuaries. But even the island populations, these are maritime, hunter-gatherer, fisher peoples, not agriculturalists. And their population densities were higher than the famous cultures like the Nuchal Nuth and the Tlingit of the Northwest coast. They also had a diverse, sophisticated maritime technology, a shell bead, money-based economy that fueled intensive regional trade. Now, the Channel Islands are also well known for being occupied very early. It was in 1959, Phil Orr at Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History found the leg bones of Arlington Spring Man 11 meters below surface in a paleo arroyo, eroding out of a cliff here. Initially dated to about 10,000 radiocarbon years, these bones were later dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, the same age as the famed Clovis culture of the interior of North America. So this suggests that there were people in boats with maritime capabilities, at the same time that Clovis people were running around hunting mammoth and mastodon in the interior. To understand the Channel Islands and their ecology, their paleogeography, here's a depiction of them at lower sea levels. The maximum lowering of sea level in the northern Channel Islands area was probably about 110 meters. And you can see that all 4 of the northern Channel Islands were linked together as a much larger 125-kilometer long island known as Santa Rosa. And it was much closer to the mainland as well, as little as 7 or 8 kilometers from the mainland, but still fully separated. Everybody probably knows this, but I threw it in anyway, a picture of the Channel Islands that just highlights that historical ecology tries to understand how ecosystems have changed through time and how humans have affected them. And that by establishing baselines in the past, we can help guide conservation restoration efforts by defining baselines, conditions prior to historic degradation, which has been very severe on the Channel Islands, as I'll show you. How do archaeologists contribute to these efforts? Well, we're very fortunate on the islands to have excellent preservation of archaeological sites. There are cave sites and open air sites. These are 2 cave sites on eastern San Miguel Island, just around the point from one another, Daisy Cave and Cave of the Chimneys. And at these two caves, the Chumash and their ancestors lived almost continuously for 11,700 years or more until almost historic times. And so by excavating samples from these shell middens, we have this sort of interleaved sequence that spans much of the last 11,000 plus years. And at Daisy Cave, the evidence suggests that there was heavy use of kelp forest resources like fish and shellfish from at least 11,700 to 8,500 years ago. And you can see some of the technology and the stratigraphy at Daisy Cave in the frames at the lower. After working at some of these sites, I see I have a typo there, we documented more than 100 paleocoastal sites now from the Northern Channel Islands that date from 13,000 to 8,000 years ago. These range from small campsites, lithic workshops, and large middens found in caves and open air settings. And here's again some of the paleo shorelines. And I note that the number of early sites on the Northern Islands, especially given the fact that roughly 75% of the islands, a former island of Santa Rosa, is now underwater, suggests that there were relatively large populations on the islands even much earlier than even I would have anticipated 20 years ago. Now, the other way that we can document very long sequences is just by radiocarbon dating middens everywhere. We don't have to excavate them all, but here's a place called Otter Point on northern San Miguel Island, and it's a huge dune. There's a couple of people on top of that dune for scale. It's over 100 feet high. And here there are shell middens that date from about 7250 to, I think the latest one is about 1200 years ago. And basically a more or less continuous sequence that gives a series of postcards about the Chumash, their technological changes, their lifeways, but also their detailed articulation with the marine ecosystems that they lived in. And just to illustrate how much information some of these contain, this is the 1200-year-old midden at the top of the dune. And you can see it's laced with all kinds of different shellfish, mussels, abalones, many more, but also pinniped remains, fish remains, bird remains, and in some cases, also seaweeds and plant remains. So we have this phenomenal sequence on the islands of well-preserved glimpses of cultural change and ecological changes over 11,700 years. But one of the problems in historical ecology is how do you link paleontology, archaeology, historical records, and then ecological and modern biological descriptions. There are different types of data sets. They can be difficult to compare, but we've made a lot of progress in the last 20 years in doing just that. We realized we had a significant problem on the Channel Islands, and that's the Chumash were taken off the island by Spanish missionaries and authorities in the 1820s. And so the first descriptions of the biota of the islands, marine ecosystems and terrestrial plant communities, really only took place in the late 1870s and the early 1900s. The first detailed ecological monitoring only in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. So we had a century gap that we wanted to plug in order to have as continuous a sequence as possible. And there was a Chinese intertidal abalone fishery from the 1850s to 1930s. Todd Brady has taken the lead on analyzing a lot of these sites and wrote a wonderful book about them recently. There are scores of these sites on the Channel Islands, and we had largely ignored them because we simply weren't interested in them. They don't seem to have that much diversity. They're mostly black abalones because there was a very large commercial fishery to harvest and dry the meat and ship it to the mainland and even all the way back to China. This fishery, once we got interested in historical ecology, became very important because it plugged a gap in our sequence, this is early historical gap. Another way we got around that gap was sort of interesting. There's an eagle nest on San Miguel Island that looked like this, and the Park Service wanted to know what was in it. It was full of faunal remains, about 10,000 faunal elements from fish, seabirds, shellfish, and mammals, and dated from about the 1850s to 1937 or 1940. We excavated it carefully, analyzed all of the remains, and it actually, it was driven by the crisis with the island fox populations, which had crashed, and they were going into captive breeding, and they were getting ready to let them loose, but they wanted to make sure that bald eagles didn't feed on foxes, island foxes. And we only found, I think, 2 fox bones out of 10,000 faunal elements, and there were very old and decrepit foxes that were probably scavenged. So that gave the green light for the National Park Service to let the foxes out and also reintroduce the bald eagles. We also, of course, relied on historical data, and there are early maps, early aerial photos that provide, and early descriptions as well, that provide a lot of information about the ecology of the Channel Islands. Brian Kindle and Mike Graham and I produced a paper in 2005 that looked at changes in the shapes of the islands, but more specifically, kelp forests. And we looked at the modern and historical kelp forests and then projected them back in time more than 10,000 years and suggested, based on bathymetric reconstructions and estimated locations of rocky reefs, rocky shorelines, that kelp forests would have been much richer around the northern Channel Islands during the terminal Pleistocene than they are even today. Well, one of the things that Jeremy Jackson told me when in Santa Barbara was that we should be measuring shellfish. And we'd never really done it before. And it probably drove my graduate students and undergraduate students crazy for about 10 years, because after he said it, we started measuring lots of shellfish. And our initial foray into try to understand whether the Chumash measurably impacted shellfish populations over time didn't show very much. You can see there's a lot of dots here spanning 10,000 years. The first 8 of them were really all over the map, and we concluded that there really, at that point, wasn't any evidence for significant impact. But as we kept measuring and measuring and measuring, eventually there was a pattern. And there's a regression line there that shows that there's a significant decline in average or mean mussel size through time. By the time you get to about 500 years ago, the mean size of a California mussel was about 30 millimeters, which is not even of reproductive age. So there was heavy use of mussels throughout the Holocene, and clearly some impact on intertidal mussel populations. We did the same thing with red abalones and got an even clearer pattern. And here you can see a lot of blue dots. You can see in the middle Holocene from about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, the mean size of abalones is quite large. And I would have you look at the far left on my screen, the historic no otter sites. These are sites of historical age that postdate the extirpation of the sea otter during the fur trade. And you can see that those shell sizes are roughly comparable to the largest ones in the middle Holocene, which suggests, in fact, that by 8,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, the heyday of the red abalone midden period, that probably the Chumash had extirpated most, but not all, of the sea otters from local waters. And I think it's entirely possible that this was an intentional sort of culling process that kept otters alive in the system. Their furs were, I'm sure, highly valued, but also kept their impact on shell fisheries down, a sort of management of shell fisheries by managing sea otter populations. We also looked at owl limpets, same story. And so about 2008, Torben Rick and Todd Brage, Renee Vilanowith, and I were all synthesizing what we had learned from the Channel Islands. A lot of this is San Miguel Island data. And this is kind of complicated, but it shows, early time on the left to late time, recent time on the right. These are all Chumash sites. And you can see changes in technology, in fishing tackle at the upper top. And then we move towards higher trophic fishes only later in time. So we were puzzling about how the Chumash sustained themselves, despite the fact that the shell fisheries show evidence for impact. And of course, Daniel Pauly had written his famous paper about fishing down food webs, the sort of modern human pattern in which you go for high trophic level fishes first. Here, it appears the opposite happened, at least over the last 10,000 years, that we started with heavy use of shellfish, a shift towards a broadening of fisheries, but the high trophic fisheries really only developed in the late Holocene, and that we think this might have been a more sustainable pattern than the modern patterns we see today. And I'll come back to some of that before, because even as we were publishing this, we were learning that there was an even earlier record on the Channel Islands that we just didn't have good samples from yet. We started looking at extinctions. One of the things that's interesting and argues for sustainability in the Chumash world is that there were very few extinctions. The mammoths went extinct about 13,000 years ago. These are mammoths that swam to the island and became Mammuthus exilus, only 4 to 5 feet high, dwarf mammoths. And they went extinct about the time that humans got there, but there's no clear evidence that humans hunted the mammoths. We do know that they hunted Chindites lawi, a flightless scoter that went extinct along the Pacific coast. But that extinction, as Terry Jones and I and colleagues showed a number of years ago, slowly unraveled over almost 10,000 years. The earliest evidence we have for Chindites hunting on the Channel Islands is about 11,700 years old. So this was not a rapid extinction of a flightless bird on the islands. It's a very slow one. Another interesting aspect of our research had to do with the Channel Island fox, which had long been thought to be a natural island endemic. There were supposed Pleistocene fox bones. We started to suspect that they might not really be Pleistocene, and we dated all of them, Torben Rick, Todd Brage and I, and others, and found out that all of them were less than, there was none of them that were older than about 7,000 years old. It appears then that humans brought the foxes to the northern islands and then transported them onto the southern Channel Islands as well. I suspect that they may have been brought out as fur bearers. This is about the time that the otters seem to have been in steep decline or heavily cold, and having an alternative source of fur might have been very important. So there is 4 animals that we know for sure, or suspect strongly that the Chumash and their ancestors brought to the islands. They brought dogs, which must have altered the ecosystems of the island substantially. We know the foxes did. They appear to have brought skunks as well, which must have been an interesting voyage. And they also brought a deer mouse, a small deer mouse that ultimately outcompeted a Pleistocene giant mouse, which was not that giant, maybe think about 30% larger than the small one. But so there was another mouse extinction, but it was probably accidental, as these new mainland mice were introduced accidentally. Something really interesting happened when the foxes were all caged up in a captive breeding program, and that is that the seabird population soared, and lots of cliff-dwelling birds like these cormorants and pelicans and seagulls as well started just nesting on the ground everywhere. It was difficult to work out on the islands at times because the birds were becoming so prolific. I suspect that the islands before humans, dogs, and foxes might have looked more like this than they do today. It was kind of a relief when they let the foxes go and the bird populations went back to being both smaller and mostly on cliff faces. Another thing that we started to look at was changes in pinniped species through time. A lot of this was driven by Bob DeLong, who's been working with the pinnipeds on the islands and along the Pacific coast for 40 years. And as we worked with him, we synthesized, Torben Rick took the lead on this, data from around the Pacific coast, along the Pacific coast, but much of it came from Channel Island sites. And we found that there had been a historical reversal in pinniped abundance. Today, northern elephant seals sort of dominate on the beaches, but in the ancient past, it's Guadalupe fur seals that dominate the archaeological record. And Guadalupes have only just recently started to breed on San Miguel. I think there's like one mother, at least about 4 or 5 years ago, there was just one mother that was pupping on San Miguel. So something obviously changed, and we weren't sure which one was the natural state. And here's those archaeological data from the islands showing prehistoric time. The Guadalupe fur seal is the white line, and you can see this index. They're very abundant all the way until the present. And the green line is elephant seals. They're very rare, relatively rare until the present. Only recently, doing zooms analysis of fragmented pinniped bone from paleocoastal sites like this one on Santa Rosa Island, which is 11,750 years old and shows evidence for heavy waterfowl, goose and duck hunting, fishing, some shellfish collecting, and trade with the mainland. But the seal bones, this site was probably 4 to 5 kilometers from the coast. Looked like it was more of a specialized winter waterfowl hunting site. But it did have small pieces of pinniped bone, as did the early layers at Daisy Cave and a couple other sites. And we ran zooms analysis and also ancient DNA analysis on those bone fragments and found that a significant proportion of them were elephant seal. And this suggests that the modern state today, where elephant seals are very abundant and also very vulnerable to human predation, probably was in fact the natural state, and that early hunters on the islands, paleocoastal peoples, probably drove elephant seals, not off the islands completely, but probably onto offshore islets and places where they could find protection from hunting. And the technology that goes along with these early paleocoastal sites look like this. They're very remarkable stem points called Channel Island barb points, chipstone crescents that were used for hunting birds. There's red ochre bone tools, Chendites bone, goose bone, duck bone, as I said. Very different type of adaptation that suggests that maybe the first islanders were not so much focusing on lower trophic level resources, but going for some of the big guys, the elephant seals, geese, ducks, things like that. On San Miguel, there also is a site complex called Cardwell Bluffs, where paleocoastal people were making similar tools, stem points and crescents. And there's no bone at these sites, but there is a lot of shellfish, including red abalone middens and kelp forest obligates. And the red abalones here are very large. This one on the lower right is about 11,400, 11,600 years old. And they're large like the heyday of red abalone middens, which suggests that sea otters may have been culled as early as 11,500 years ago. Well, in more recent years, we have continued to work on marine ecosystems, trying to understand the differences, but we've also shifted again toward land to understand the fire history, the history of dune building on the island, how it affected humans and other resources, also pollen data, and then archaeobotanical data, including important work that's been done by my wife here, pictured Christina Gill. Her work is showing that geophytes, these are geophytes called blue dicks, that are extraordinarily abundant on the islands. And this is a picture of the coastal terrace on Santa Rosa Island in the spring. And in the middle of a 4-year drought, they were having super blooms of these geophytes that are being fueled probably not so much by rainfall, but by heavy fog drift. You can see the fog bank in the background. But the islands are littered with literally billions of these blue dicks. And prior to the removal of cattle and sheep and deer and elk, these were being mowed down. There were pigs on most of the islands, introduced pigs that were digging them up. And after the Park Service and the Nature Conservancy has removed these, they are just going into super bloom abundance. And it's making it clear, both the modern ecology, the restoration ecology, and Christina's work on sites of the last 11,500 years, that these geophytes were a fundamental staple throughout the Holocene. Again, a low trophic level food combined with shellfish, these would have sustained people for thousands and thousands of years, we think. Well, all of that complexity, amazing population densities, technologies, artistic traditions of the Chumash came to a crash with Spanish colonization in AD 1769. And within about 40 or 50 years, the Chumash on the islands had abandoned their villages or been removed to mainland towns and missions like this, Mission Santa Barbara. The globalization that came along with Spanish and European spread around the world led to a sea of slaughter with whaling, sealing, sea otter hunting that just devastated the marine ecosystems, the marine communities of the Santa Barbara Channel and the larger Pacific and world. The historical fur trade of the 18th and 19th century on the Channel Islands, particularly focused on the sea otter, complete extirpation within 20, 30, 40 years, also caused a series of fundamental ecological changes. Trophic cascades that Jim Estes has documented in the Aleutians, and we've now documented on the Channel Islands, where you remove the otters, sea urchins go crazy, prolific abundance, they mow down kelp forests. California, they don't destroy them completely, but they reduce their productivity significantly. And so a series of trophic cascades were caused by these historical devastation. And then the terrestrial environment, and to some extent, the nearshore intertidal, the nature of beaches, has been fundamentally altered on virtually all the islands, or was altered by early ranching and livestock introduction. On Santa Rosa Island, pictured here, there were lots of cattle, lots of sheep. They brought in elk and deer and pigs, and really altered our view of what the islands were like. And it destroyed the hydrology, the plant communities, and sort of led to a long-term view that the islands were marginal for human habitation, which is completely at odds with the archaeological record. Yet, in the Anthropocene, on a planet altered by humans, heavily altered by humans, the California Channel Islands are now sources of hope and inspiration for me and for many others. They are surrounded, they're protected, number one, by the Park Service and the Nature Conservancy. They are surrounded by the Channel Islands Marine Sanctuary, including large no-fish zones. Marine mammal populations have rebounded, exploded in some cases, and the removal of livestock and other exotic mammals is leading to a restoration of the hydrology, the terrestrial ecology, the biodiversity of the islands. And archaeological data are fundamentally contributing to our understanding of past biodiversity, ecological baselines, and conservation efforts on the islands. And just a couple of instances of restoration success stories. Here's San Miguel Island's massive Point Bennett Pinniped rookery, where 6 species and literally 60 to 80,000 seals and sea lions come ashore to breed, rest, and pup every year. This is one reason for hope. Although, as I've noted, it may not be a fully natural state. The blue dot there is a very substantial Chumash house pit village right in the middle of the rookery, dating to about 500 years ago, and suggesting that it didn't exist, very unlikely to have existed 500 years ago. In fact, the midden deposits there are mostly shellfish and fish with very few pinniped bones. Another major success for the Park Service and the Nature Conservancy is the decline and recovery of the island fox. and the captive breeding program that led to their restoration and the removal of the golden eagles that caused their populations to crash. It's ironic that millions and millions of dollars were spent on restoring the island fox that the Chumash appear to have introduced to the islands 7,500 years ago, but I don't know any archaeologists that disagree that the island fox shouldn't have been saved. I don't think we would reintroduce dogs to the island. And then bald eagles are another recent reintroduction. This is a photo of that nest we excavated on San Miguel in 1937, and then a picture of a nesting bald eagle on the islands today. It's a wonderful thing to go out to the islands and see bald eagles returned to their natural habitat. So in summary, the Channel Islands and the adjacent mainland have changed dramatically over 13,000 years or more of human presence. The Chumash clearly shaped island ecosystems for millennia with measurable impacts to some resources, but they also appear to have conducted habitat management and enhancement via periodic burning and other measures, perhaps including the control of sea otter populations, starfish populations, etc. The Chumash thrived on the islands for thousands of years, creating a complex, sustainable culture and economy. And in contrast, European colonization devastated the Chumash and island ecosystems in 200 years of overhunting, overfishing, overgrazing, and other impacts. Thankfully, we came to our senses, created national park and a preserve by the Nature Conservancy, and the Channel Islands are now protected, and restoration efforts provide lessons of hope and inspiration, as well as new understanding of the original richness of island ecosystems. I have a thank you here. I particularly should call out Torben Rick, Renee Vilanowith, Amira Anise, Christina Gill, Todd Brady, Leslie Reeder. These have been my colleagues in all of this work, and this presentation leans as heavily on their hard work and research as it does my own. I shamelessly put in a plug for our most recent book, An Archaeology of Abundance, which reevaluates the supposed marginality of the California islands, both Alta and Baja, and we think has potential important for island ecosystems around the world. And then finally, Todd Brady, Amy Gusick, and I are archaeologists working on a large project funded by the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, which is looking at the potential archaeology and the biology of the submerged landforms of Santa Rosa, and recent coring that's taken place offshore. We found intact soils. We haven't found any archaeology yet, but we're quite certain that if we poked enough cores, we would in fact find submerged archaeological sites. So there is hope that we'll find significant information on the biology and the archaeology of Santa Rosa in years to come offshore. And then most of all, I want to thank all of you, because that's the end of my talk.